Okay. I welcome you all in the second session of the day. I am happy to welcome Dr. Vishal Vadani sir for the post-lunch session. He is serving as the Director, International Center for Applied Gandhian Studies, Lok Bharti, Sanosra, Bhavnagar. He worked as a faculty in English with the premier institutes and universities of the state such as the MSU, IITE, Marwadi University, GTU. He also wrote and translated textbooks for Cambridge University Press, Gujarat State School Textbook Board, National Institute of Open Schooling, etc. He has also prepared training manuals for the Finishing School Program, Government of Gujarat, and learning material for Baba Ambedkar University, and trained thousands of teachers and professors across the state on learning, unlearning, and co learning. He has also translated novels of Dhruv Bhatt such as Timir Panthi and Akupar in English, the sociology textbook of 11th standard for the National Institute of Open Schooling into Gujarati. He is working as a translation expert with Gujarat School Textbook Board and Delhi Sahitya Academy. He has also delivered expert talks at several platforms such as a Grand Education Fair, Ahmedabad, DC Gandhinagar, Symbiosis University, Pune, Christ College Rajkot, English Department, SPU and Bhavnagar University, Sahitya Academy, Gandhinagar, ITI Rajkot, KCG Ahmedabad, to name a few. He has a great passion for creative writing, translation, philosophy, and learning processes. I once again welcome you, sir. I request you to start the session, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Niruma Madam, for the wonderful introduction. I take this opportunity to thank Gandhinagar Institute of Technology, AICT, and all the participants, Dr. Sneha Patel, and all other faculty members who have been involved in this organization of very beautiful short-term training program on communication and ethics in the 21st century. As you know that post-lunch session is always slightly dicey and tough for all of us to get engaged. So what I've done is I prepared a presentation, but I would like to request all of you to use your chat box as and when we need it, and I would like to hear from you questions, particularly in the form of text, and in the end when we have Q&A sessions. Let's see how many of you are still yeah, so some people are joining, so they will join us later. But may I request all of you to just name the place and the state you belong to in the chat box, so that I can draw some analogies from respective regions, wherever, whatever little I know. So may I request every one of you to use your chat box and just write down name of the place you belong to, particularly district and state. It'll be great help. Yeah, let me start by myself. So it'll be more and more workshop kind of thing. Very good, excellent. Participants have started. You can see in the chat box. All right, so we have people from Vasad, Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar, and still, I believe, yeah, Gandhinagar. Great. And other people may also, yes, Valsad. We have people from Valsad. It's a great mixture of probably entire state, wherein we have joined from different districts. Yes, Ahmedabad. Yes, great. All right. So meanwhile, as and when the participants join, they may just type into the chat box and they'll get the hint of what we have been doing here. So let me go back to the. I hope you can hear me properly and you can see my screen properly.
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
So the topic that I have selected, and the organizers were kind enough to allow me to stick to the topic, is neuroscience of ethics. In past couple of days, you have heard a lot about technology, ethics, communication, 21st century, and all the speakers that you have heard so far, and I have had the privilege of studying under them directly or indirectly. Let me make it very clear at the very onset that I am not an expert in neurology, nor am I a practicing doctor in the field of cognitive science. I'm an explorer of neuroscience. I'm an observer or a keen student of what happens to human brain during different learning processes, during different life situations. So I've been exploring this field for a couple of years now. So that's why I've selected to talk about neuroscience of ethics, or this newly emerged discipline is known as neuromorality. So this session has been divided into two clear parts. In the first part, we will discuss neuroscience in the 21st century, where this discipline has reached, and what are some of the fantastic takeaways for teachers, for all of us who are dealing with higher education, for all of us who wish to implement some of the best practices of neuroscience right at the heart of the classroom. So that's the first part of the session. Second part of the session is the very topic that I've selected, neuroscience of ethics. What happens to brain or when we experience moral dilemmas, those mind-boggling situations wherein we'll have to decide what is right, what is wrong, what is proper, what is improper, what is socially acceptable, what is not acceptable, what happens to the brain. And so our agenda for today is to understand these two aspects and to leverage this knowledge for the optimum use of our students. So let's enter the first part. So I always love to use the Socratic method of question and answer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to raise several questions, and many of these questions are my own propositions, my own queries, and my own humble submissions. So the first is when I heard this title, that ethics and communication in the 21st century. So the obvious question I had is, why talk about ethics in the 21st century? Right? What has changed? We had our problems in the 20th century, and we tried to deal with those problems in our limited ways, and we had whatever consequences we had. Now something has changed in the 21st century in a very, very meaningful ways. So we need to explore reasons why talk about ethics in the 21st century, and why organizers have thought very wisely about this particular topic. So here are my reading of the first two decades of 21st century. I believe these are the emerging threats in the 21st century. So many of these threats have had their roots in the 20th century, but now the monster is growing, right? So we need to address each of this monster. And how are we going to address these monsters? The tool that we are selecting, the tools that we have or we'll have to take recourse to these tools, and they are ethics and communication. So in this discussion, I'll focus only on ethics because you have your platter is full with discussion on communication. So the first threat is we can see all around our lives that social institutions like religion, family, marriage, education, they are collapsing. Previously, when people had problems or troublesome situations in their lives, they used to go to these social institutions, and more or less, these institutions provided satisfactory solutions to them. But 21st century has brought a sea change in the very fabric of these institutions. These days, we have a huge class of people who have done away with religion. We have families getting scattered day by days. We have marriage institution which is under a great kind of question mark, and we have education system which is also the pyramid of education has almost collapsed. So that is first threat that is emerging and growing leaps and bounds. Second is the very idea of communities has got fluid. Now, previously, the idea of community as a kind of problem solving mechanism used to be physical communities wherein group of people used to stay together and they used to solve their problems with the help of, let's say, village heads and panchayats and stuff like that. But now communities have grown multifold. For example, we have digital communities. We have bigger communities than some of the nations on the planet on the screen. So that has posed several problems in front of us. Third issue is depletion of resources and climate crisis. Now that cannot be denied because individually and collectively, we have our share in damaging the earth, whether we accept it or we don't. Fourth is ever widening gap between the rich and the poor. Previously, that gap was kind of limited and we could scale it. Now that gap is growing so much that we will have tough time sometime very sooner. Fifth is terrorism. We have new face of terrorism. We have terrorism actively working on digital space, and now they are no more after the atomic weapons, they are after bioweapons. That is also a huge problem for all of us. And of course, cybercrime at individual level, something that is looming large over our heads or in front of our screen on our fingertips, underneath our passwords, security systems. That is cybercrime. Extreme individualism. Now that is a philosophical problem. We have inherited that problem from our Western counterparts. Extreme individualism makes people rights conscious rather than duty conscious. Now, when people exercise their rights very aggressively, they deploy violence. So that's why right now you see almost everywhere in the world, people are on the streets. The best example is the kind of farmers' protests that's going on in India. So extreme individualism is at the root of the collective psyche that has been shaped in recent past. Indian philosophy has always prioritized duty. That's why we have had the terms like dharma in terms of duty. So we had Raj Dharma, Pati Dharma, Patni Dharma, Bhakta Dharma, Kavi Dharma. So this dharma as in duty has always been given an advantage over rights. And when people practice dharma first, duty first, then the other groups do not have to ask for or demand for their rights. So when people are on the streets, it means that somebody somewhere has missed, or somebody somewhere has decided to exclude certain groups of people. Now that exclusion is very problematic. Finally, due to artificial intelligence and automation, we are heading towards rise of the economically useless class. So the automation industry will take away so many jobs, and people will be free. Now, free means so many things. Free means they will create larger issues in the society, in their families, and everywhere they belong to. So these are the threats, and that's why it becomes perennial for all of us to talk about, to discuss, to explore, to contemplate ethical concerns in the 21st century. Second is, why should we care for climate change or extinction of tigers or cyber crimes? For instance, most of us are not going to be there after 100 years. So then why should we care for this earth? Or maybe take out rallies for saving tigers? Why? Is there anything that is at the core that compels us to have rallies and campaigns and seminars and conferences on these issues? Well, I guess yes, there is something very inherent for past millions of years in all of us, and that is we have to worry about these issues because we are interconnected and interdependent. So that is the bottom line proposition, that since we are interconnected and interdependent, we will have to think about all these issues and all these monsters that we talked about. Yeah, we cannot do away with this interconnectedness, because as mammals we are social animals, and social animals are by nature interdependent and interconnected. So now let's hit our target for the day. So now we have understood the larger issues and larger problems. So now the question is, but why are we going to neurology to find solutions? Can't we talk to UNESCO? Can't we talk to UN? Can't we talk to our respective governments? Can't we go to religious leaders? Can't we go to the education? We have so many alternatives, so many change makers. These are all valid change makers of the world. But then, why I'm arguing today that we should go to neurology rather than or along with these valid institutions that we have in the world? Well, let me take you to the heart of neurology. Why this discipline has so much to offer, and uh, why we know so little about it. So, this is the Time magazine cover of 1960s, and as you can see, there is a gentleman, and his name is Charles Whitman. Now, as you know, that when somebody is featured on the cover of Time magazine, something big might have happened. Otherwise, they don't, give that much importance to that particular person. So this Charles Whitman did something unusual. He was a gentleman in his family, in his neighborhood, but one day it so happened that he killed his mother and his wife. He didn't stop there. He took out his AK-47, drove down to the University of Texas, went up to the terrace, and started shooting students and faculties who were moving about the ground. He shot almost 60 to 80 people dead. He went on shooting unless police came and knocked him down. shot him dead. Now the question is, why did he behave so weirdly? What happened? So the investigation started. So they asked Charles Whitman's neighbors. So neighbors reported that Charles Whitman was such a gentleman that he never quarreled with any one of us, and he used to take even our dogs on a round. So he was in that sense very friendly. So the police looked up, investigated his room, and they found that entire room is very well organized, like everything in place. So they were struggling really hard to get the clue, and finally they got his personal diary. Now this diary has a revolutionary idea in it, and we got so much of insight about neurology of what he had written in his diary. Let's look at what Charles Whitman wrote before he died. He wrote that I have been having fierce and violent impulses. I have had some tremendous headaches. I am prepared to die. After my death, I wish an autopsy on me to be performed to see if there is any mental disorders. And Charles Whitman left a check of $30,000 for conducting this autopsy. Now, autopsy is a basic process to cut the head open, look at the brain, dissect the brain, and see if there are any problems. Okay, so that's what he wanted. And so police and the clinical team, they did what Charles Whitman's last wish was, and what they found was surprising. So this is the picture of our brain, and as you can see, there is a little green button-like area at the middle of the brain. This area is called amygdala. Now, amygdala is largely responsible for fear, rage, and aggression. Whenever we feel these kind of emotions, these kinds of impulses, it means something has triggered amygdala. Okay, so that's the button for rage and aggression. So when they carried out autopsy on Charles's brain, what they found was there was a massive tumor in this part of the brain called amygdala. So this single event opened up the box, and uh, that was the beginning of a new discipline called neurocriminology. Can we study the brains of the criminals and see if there are problems? Of course, it led to controversy also. For instance, criminals cannot get away by saying that, okay, there's a problem in my brain and that's why I committed that particular crime. So there was this huge controversy on this particular case. But largely, what we can deduce from here is there is an area in the brain that is responsible for such behavior. So it is not always that people behave intentionally unethical. When people go out of their way and they take immoral decisions or unethical decisions, it is not always that it is their own choice 100%. There might be certain portion of share of this particular movement, biochemical movement in the brain. Let me give you another example. So there was this lady, she married to a man. So it was a second marriage, and the lady already had a daughter of, let's say, 10 years of age from the previous marriage. So she brought her daughter along in this new relationship. After a year or two, this lady called up the police one day and reported that please come immediately and arrest my husband. The police came and discussed with the lady that what happened. So she said that my husband has turned a pedophile. Now, pedophile are the people whose sexual orientation is towards children, right? Their sexual orientation moves from adults to children. So that is the disease, neurological disease. So, but how did she know? She knew because her husband's laptop was full of child pornography. Okay, so based on that, she inferred that something is wrong with my husband, and I have a daughter with me, and I have to be very careful. So she reported the fact. So police came, arrested him, took him to the various tests, psychological, neurological tests, and again, what they found is this. As you can see here, this is a massive tumor, and this is the region that decides a person's sexual orientation. On all these three images, you can see there's a lump over here, there's a tumor over here. So in this particular case, the doctors, neurologists, they removed the tumor, and that person was back to normal. How amazing that certain crimes could be prevented if we know well in advance the how mental faculties are organized and whether there are problems in different faculties. So these two cases are very important to enter the field of neurology and to see in depth the potential of this field has. So what do we know in terms of neurology? So we know how to hack human brains, right? How to control people, and not that we have begun to understand this right now. We have always controlled humans by using different hacking techniques. So previously, we used stories and myths. For example, stories of Pap and Punya, stories of heaven and hell. So when you tell these stories and tell people that if you don't behave wisely, ethically, you will go to hell. Okay, so that's how their brain were controlled, and through brain their behaviors were controlled. With that, and later on, we had ideologies, so many ideology. Hitler had his own ideology, and through that he controlled people. And today we have cognitive science and artificial intelligence together. By collaborating, they are controlling, hacking our brains, and most of us are unaware. Of course, throughout these processes, there has always been chemicals and drugs like tea and alcohol to trigger certain portions. So even today, as all of you know that, during elections, how people are manipulated with the help of alcohol. So that's the fact that nobody can deny, and newspapers tell us clear and loud stories. So right now, with the help of technology, we exactly know two things. Right now, technology has advanced so much that we know the trigger points in the brain, and second is how to manipulate them. So we know which button controls what behavior. So by any means, if you can control that button, you can guide that person's behavior accordingly or as per your will. So in a minute, I would like to explain how brain cells communicate, because for many of us, this neurology and brain is a new topic, new subject. Some of you might be already aware, but a little repetition is always good for reinforcement of knowledge. So these brain cells communicate via a change in electrical frequency from very low to very high. So that when that happens, it is called neuron firing. For example, when you learn something, okay, some neurons fire, they light up. It means that this new learning has taken place or has stepped into your brain, and if you practice more, those steps becomes permanent holding for the new learning in the brain. So for every little movement, from my words, the way I speak to the way you listen, right now billions of neurons are firing in our brains. Okay, so when you prepare clusters of these brain cells and brain regions, you get to know, okay, this is responsible for love, this is responsible for my faith in the God, this is responsible for my relationship or my hunger or my violence or peace or my moral judgments. So by recording and analyzing neuron firing, we can even decode what we are thinking about. Now, this is really, really surprising and eye-opening. And there is tremendous research going on right now in the world to decode people's thoughts even before they articulate them. For example, the picture that you are seeing right now is of a cognitive scientist called Moran Surf. He's from Israel, and he has written a wonderful book called Moth. His research has been published in magazine called Nature. And those of you who are from science and engineering background know it very well that when something is published in Nature, it is of the best quality. And what is his research about? His research is about projecting our dreams on a screen. I repeat, projecting our dreams on a screen. So when we are sleeping and we are dreaming crazy things, it is quite possible in a decade or two that those dreams can be watched on a bigger screen or a smaller screen. So in a lighter note, I always say that we will have to be very careful in dreaming now because somebody's got to be watching them. Okay, so that is happening in a big way. So I call this era the era of neuro enlightenment. Okay, all of us, whatever we do is decided by neuron firing. There is no doubt about it. There is nothing beyond the brain chemistry, okay, or brain biology and brain biochemistry. So if we want to attain enlightenment of any kind, the road passes through neurology. That's why I call this neuro enlightenment. And there has been successful experiments of brain manipulation. Okay, you are well aware that first experiments are always carried on rats and other animals. So there's an Indian origin doctor in the USA, Stanford University, Dr. Sanjeev, and he hypothesized that whether the rat will go to right or left, how does the rat decide that? So if we agree that there are different switches for different functions and different behavior in the brain, then we will also agree that, so there is a particular button, there's a particular neuron pattern in the brain. When that pattern triggers, the rat decides to go to left or go to right. And that is a parallel process to what the rat is seeing or sniffing or receiving information through its senses. Okay, so so it goes parallel. So Dr. Sanjeev thought that can we press those buttons from the outside of the brain? So then he carried out the experiment by putting a chip on a rat's brain, and with the remote controlled, he successfully controlled a rat's sense of direction. When he pressed the right button, rat went to the right. When he pressed the left button, rat went to the left direction. But if you ask the rat that how did you decide to go to left or right, rat will tell you that it was its own decision to go to left or right, because it doesn't matter who pushes the button. What matters is the result of the button. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether that brain button has been pressed from the outside or inside. So rat has no clue that somebody is controlling that behavior, right? Now where does this take us? So those of you who have seen the fantastic movie called Inception, okay, it's of course a fiction, a kind of a stretched fiction, right? That to plant and steal ideas from somebody's brain. But you will be surprised to know that uh, Professor Moran Cerf was advising director of Inception on how this is possible neurologically. So right now, yes, it is a fiction, but it is not going to be fiction forever. And we have so many clues, we have so many experiences in our day-to-day life, how this is happening in a big way. For example, Elon Musk is not a stranger name for all of us. Elon Musk has founded a company along with many of his companies. The name of the company is Neuralink. Started in 2016 and with a fund of 158 million US dollars. When Elon Musk invests something, and we have to be careful because he sees future in a very different manner. So what does Neuralink do? What does it prepare? Neuralink prepares brain chips. The X-ray that you are seeing on the screen is the true X-ray of a person with embedded brain chip. This is a brain chip which is connected to the bionic eye, 2016. So that person was able to see with the help of bionic eye and chip. Let me also bring to your knowledge that today in the USA, there are 40,000 people with the chips in their head. But these are not brain enhancement chips. These chips are support system to one or the other brain related diseases. So right now, of course, now there are ethical concerns. Should we allow scientists to insert chips in the human brains to enhance performance of the brain? All such ethical concerns were once so much rigid, and later on they have been loosened up. So don't worry, in the future you will not have chip big like this, a huge memory card, right? It will be small like this, the kinds of memory cards that we use. Okay, so in future it is very much possible that people will be walking very easily in the room with the chips already implanted in their brains, and it would be like new ultra normal. Like today people are walking with the cell phones or smart watches or Google glasses, they'll walk along with these chips. All right, so the knowledge that has been created by neurology has always been used first by the corporate giants. We, the teachers or the academicians, are always lagging behind in leveraging the knowledge produced by neurology. How? 75% of videos that we watch on YouTube are suggested by YouTube worldwide. Remember the analogy? it doesn't matter who presses the button. What matters is what behavior it drives. So you might feel that, okay, it is my mobile data, it is my smartphone, and it is I who is deciding what to watch. But that's not true. That's not scientifically true, at least in the YouTube databases. Okay, somebody somewhere sitting in the Silicon Valley has the remote control. That is the era of brain manipulation. Amazon is number one company to use the best of the neuro practices, the best of the neuro practices. So as you know that Amazon time and again comes up with these huge mega sales, okay, sales festivals, okay. And if you look at the advertisements, they use something called FOMO, fear of missing outs. So those of you who have seen the Naptol advertisements, okay, you will see there are salespersons who are literally shouting at you, and there is a siren of an ambulance that you can hear in the background. They will not give you a breathing space. There's a huge wall or tick 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 that is going on right in front of your screen. So what they are doing is they are manipulating the brain, particularly in the region that triggers sense of emergency. So if you feel that emergency, that urgency, that if I don't buy it right now, it will go away, I will lose the opportunity, and you buy it. So then you are trapped. They have pressed the button and it worked out. So that is what is happening in a big way. Not only that, in the marketing, they teach an exclusive paper on neuromarketing. Okay. So from early in the morning till late night, whatever advertisements we see are rooted in these principles of controlling human brain and driving behavior. Those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones or such series, here we are taking the example of Game of Thrones. Why is it so much of kind of, why is it driving people crazy? People are mad after GOT, Game of Thrones, particularly the youngsters, our students kind of group. They don't miss a single series, single episode, single season of this. So this is our entertainment industry. Entertainment industry too uses the best of the research carried out in the field of neurology. How? Here on the screen, what you can see is different readings of the brain when people are watching Game of Thrones and when they are listening to the audiobook, the same audiobook of Game of Thrones. So the red is the performance of the audiobook, the blue is video. So the parameters, variables are temperature, heart rate, and EDA. Now these readings, you might be wondering that our common assumption is videos are more engaging. But these readings tell us that on an average, people get more and more engaged in audio. Reason being, audio allows imagination. Video restricts imagination. So that's how these neurological researches have been used in designing and preparing such wonderful series and films. So what we can conclude from the first part is that be it shopping, be it our entertainment, even education. Right now you can see from Byju's to Vedantus, everybody has started bombarding their advertisements in people's heads, and students are learning also. Even that fact cannot be denied. And Corona has done a great job in shooting up, in skyrocketing this screen-based learning interfaces. So this neurology is affecting almost every bit of our life. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the first part. Now let's move to the second part, neuroscience of ethics or neuromorality. Now, there are several terms used for this because this is an emerging science and emerging disciplines. So, some people call it like neuroscience of ethics, or some people call it ethical neurology and neurological ethics and cognitive ethics or cognitive morality and stuff like that. So, whatever I'm going to discuss in this part is based on two of my favorite books. The first book is by a very interesting professor and a scientist called Patricia Churchland, and she has written a beautiful book called Brain Trust. Look at the word brain and trust. Is there anything that is responsible for trusting people? Okay, is there anything that happens in the brain? Okay. So there's a beautiful Kindle edition of this book, and now I believe the hard copy is always is also out. So subtitle is What Neuroscience About Morality. And the second book is Elements of Moral Cognition. Cognition is the thought process. So what happens when we have to take moral decisions? Also with this, there's one more person that I would like to mention here. His name is Professor C.V. Ramachandran. He is a professor of neurology at California University, and he has done extensive research in the field, and his book is known as the Phantom Limb. The Phantom Limb. In 2012, now we are entering the realm of ethics and neurology. In 2012, in Italy, a bunch of neurons were discovered. They are here in the right hand corner of the brain. These neurons are called mirror neurons. Why these neurons are called mirror neurons? Because these neurons are responsible for empathy, compassion, and when you see others in pain and you experience at least a certain or a certain shade of that pain in your heart, or at least you say, oh, that is, I pity that person. So why do you feel that pain? That's because your neurons are mirroring, is capturing the same image, and you have this feeling that something like that could happen to you also. So this Professor C.V. Ramachandran calls these mirror neurons. He gives these neurons very interesting title. He calls these neurons Gandhi neurons, because Gandhi also is an epitome of compassion, of thinking about others. Okay, so when we discussed why should we care if tigers go extinct, why should we care if there are climate crisis, or why should we care if people behave unethically, we must care because we are connected naturally, interdependent and interconnected. So my discussion and my arguments are based on these two words. You can read these two books. So the second book is by John Mikhail, very interesting observation of language and morality. So where do our ethics and morals come from? So that's the fundamental question. From the very beginning, we have had this assumption. Okay, humans go by imaginations and assumption. So we have had this assumption that it comes from religious teaching, it comes from culture. All right, valid point. But if you look at the history of human evolution, if you trace that history anthropologically, you will notice that religion came much later. Before that, we had the brain. Okay, so what we are saying is religion is not the fundamental source of ethics. No, it is not the fundamental source of ethics or our moral judgments. So if you think that by telling moral stories to your kids, they'll become moral, well, I guess that's taking it too far. It's not possible. And the best example is the kind of moral teaching that is going on every day in terms of religious stories. Nevertheless, society has not changed much in terms of its moral quotient, MQ. Okay. The reason being is organized religion is a product of agricultural revolution. Okay, when hunter gatherers started, plowing fields and started agriculture and settled and built communities, much after that, much after stable life, the idea of organized religion came. So before that, we had already an evolved brain. Okay, brain that we had was already. Okay. May I request someone to please mute your mic? Uh, we get noise of the utensils. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so our brain was already in place. So much of the homework was done for religious supplementary job. What was that? So large communities, when communities started migrating, in large groups, so they required an agreement on various aspects of life, which is why they need an unseen lawgiver. And that's where the idea of God comes into picture. So, for example, if both of us or all of us belong to different communities, let's say 1 million years ago, and we cross each other somewhere, so we need an agreement that we are not each other's lunch, right? We have to respect that. And if we do that, some unseen lawgiver will punish us somewhere. Okay, so for that it was required. So that's what I was saying, that humans use stories, okay, to strengthen and pass on moral codes. However, these stories are the superstructures on the evolutionary mechanism of the humans. Entering from neurology, we are going backwards and we are entering evolutionary biology. So what does evolutionary biology tell us? So in a very, very, very naively, to oversimplify things, we have mammals and reptiles, okay? So mammalian brain has certain things in common. All the mammals, including humans and apes and elephants, and so they have certain things in common. And reptiles have certain things in common. So what happens? So when reptiles lay eggs, they hatch them, and the newly born babies, they go away from the parents sooner than the newly born babies go away from the parents in the mammal communities. So humans are not only the social animals. Almost all the mammals have societies in their own respective limited manners. For example, you have elephants, right? Elephants have wonderful social life. When one elephant dies at one particular place, the entire group, that entire society goes to that place for 3 consecutive days to mourn, okay, to lament over the death. And there are so many such beautiful examples. Okay, we have so many varieties in rats, wherein uh, they, like, male and female meet, they mate, they make, and they remain together forever. Okay, they don't go and part their ways like humans. Their marriage system is so intact. Okay, so with mammal, now we focus on the mammals. So mammals have more responsibility than just security. Okay, so mammals not only secure their babies, they provide food and love, compassion. Okay, when you provide love and compassion to your counterparts, your relatives, then there is inherent mechanism in the brain that you don't hurt those people in any way. Largely, largely mother mammals do not hurt their babies. Of course, father do attack. Okay, If you see in various mammal species, at times mothers have to literally fight with the fathers to secure their babies. So that mammalian brain has that mechanism to take care of others. Because when mammals live in a society, social inclusion is a very useful and rewarding experience. And social exclusion, like an outcasting somebody, is very disturbing and painful experience. So if you want to be in the society, you will have to agree to certain norms. This is like pretty clear. That if you want to be in this society, you'll have to adhere to these norms and these regulations. So social acceptance, okay, and the mutual safety, security of food, right, and warmth and compassion. This mechanism is very much there in our biology. So it is not that after reading certain moral stories we have become suddenly moral. No, it is not like once in a blue moon kind of event. So which is why they learn and acquire moral norms of the groups naturally. Okay, so it is as natural as any other natural needs of the mammals. We know that oxytocin as an hormone plays a key role. Now, you know it very well that when we fall in love, it is not the heart that controls the love. It is the brain, and particularly this hormone called oxytocin, which is also known as love hormone. Okay, so it is only when that love hormone is released, you fall in or fall out of love. And when you hug each other, when mother and child or parents and children hug one another, there is a release of oxytocin. It's a feel good hormone. Okay, so those all of you who have ever been into love, they know what I'm talking about. So that feel good experience is rooted in our biology, right? So that's why mammals like to touch. They want to be physically very much proximate, or in a very closed circle they remain, and that's how they fight against the predators, or they fight against any odds. So that's the key strength. If you want to see this in humans, it is cooperation. So if humans cooperate, it is their natural design. If humans learn how to communicate non-violently, it is their natural design. So right now, what we are seeing in terms of violence, in terms of communicating with a view to hurt somebody, is an unnatural behavior, I would say. Is not something that we have been designed for. So from this little exploration or trespassing in the field of evolutionary biology, what we deduce, what we conclude is this: as social animals, humans are moral animals too. It is our natural design. So from this, now we'll take a road that takes us to a different field. Okay, why ethics matter in the 21st century? We have to address that with the help of course, neurology. In 1833, William Foster Lloyd gave a beautiful theory. I request everybody to go and read that paper and get familiar with this wonderful concept of tragedy of the commons. What is the tragedy of the commons? That there is a limited area or limited field, and there are cowherds to graze their cows. Now, what will happen if each one of the cowherds go on adding cows in that limited area of the grazing? So I feel that what will happen is that someday we'll go out of resources, and we will have to face situations wherein people will be fighting for resources. So that was one of the caveat that I listed in the list of my emerging threats, wherein I discussed that somewhere we'll have to be very careful in terms of sharing these resources. So when we say resources, tragedy of the commons, we are talking about different ways of adjusting with one another. And when people do not adjust with one another, they are likely to fight. And it is when they fight, their moral judgments come into picture. Yeah, excuse me. So what happens in the tragedy of the commons? Commons is the ground. So we are exploiting this earth, we are exploiting natural resources, and all of us are fighting for it. So someday we will exhaust this, and on the process, we will take so many immoral decisions. So many. We will be like Thanos of the end game. The tragedy of the commons tells us that if each one of us behaves as per our individual rational behavior, we will harm the collective good. For example, if each one of us, everybody on the planet feels that, well, it is my life, I should have as many cows as I wish. Fine, it is your life, but then it will affect the commons, the finiteness of our resources. And it is then that we'll have to dig deeper into this human brain on what happens when we take such decisions of, let's say, charity, of, let's say, living with less, minimalism as they call it, living with less. What happens to their brains? So when we look into the human brains of taking moral decisions, we have wonderful scientist, and I'll share his name also, and he has brought this beautiful discoveries. He says that there are two modes of taking moral decisions. First is intuitive moral decision. So that is something which is there even if we have not heard any moral stories. Intuitive, our gut feeling. And second is controlled moral cognition. So it is after you are exposed to your social, cultural, religious sense of morality. So let's say if I if I promise something and there is a time when I have to break that promise, and if I remember the story of the Ramayana, that no, Ram kept his father's promise, so I should also keep my promise. So in this case, I am going to the second mode of taking moral decision, and that is the controlled moral cognition, wherein I have time to take that decision. In courts, for example, when judges give their judgments, they have time. So they use this mode. But at times we do not have that time. We have to take very intuitive and very very abrupt moral decision, moral cognition. So which is better from these two? So when scientists carried out experiments on people, what they discovered, and that is the name of the scientist called Joshua Green from Howard University, and his experiments suggest that people take more contributive decisions intuitively than they do by controlled cognition. I repeat, people take more contributive decisions intuitively than they do by controlled cognition. So the experiment was something like this. A group of people were taken to a picnic spot wherein they were enjoying, they were doing some activities, and they were shown homeless people with their clothes in rags and tattered. They were shown such people, and they were asked whether any one of the group members would like to contribute something for the betterment of these homeless people. 68% people decided that they would contribute. When the same experiment was done, when the group was not taken to the picnic spot, but they were shown the photograph of the homeless people, the same people, but only mobile photographs. They were asked that these are the homeless people, and if you want to contribute something for their betterment, only 34% people decided and they agreed that they would like to contribute. What it tells us that people who were watching photographs of the homeless people, beggars, they had time to think about their own, gog their sense of morality. Whereas people who like encounter homeless people right on the place and they had to take decision right there, they are more intuitively responsible. Okay, so I'm reminded of a wonderful writer, American short story writer called uh, yeah, I forgot the name of one. Yeah, Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury. He said that in quickness is truth. In quickness is truth. In order to give some response, if you take time, which means you are cooking up the stories, but whatever comes, with a smashing return, it is the truth. So here what we understand is that this inherent mechanism of taking moral decision is already there in the brain. Now the question is, can we investigate neural basis of the intuitive moral cognition? क्या हम इसको खोल के देख सकते हैं? Can we go deeper into the brain and see what happens when we take moral decision or during the process of moral cognition? Well, the answer is big fat yes. We can do it. Next question is how. So there are these two methods used. Now we are going slightly technical here, but you will enjoy knowing about these facts. So we have fMRI, we are familiar with MRI, and we have ERP systems. So these are technical devices and processes to see what is happening inside the brain when we are performing tasks that assess moral reasoning and judgments. Let's look at, so fMRI is called functional magnetic resonance imaging. Okay, so this is the kind of machine, you might have seen that. So how does fMRI work? So people are taken to that machine. So as people engage in cognitive tasks, and what are the cognitive tasks? Moral dilemmas, wherein they have to decide whether to take A or B, wherein A being morally right, B being morally wrong. Or they are presented with emotionally charged images, or moral and immoral scenes. What happens is, when they come across these two or either of these aspects, fresh blood flows towards the brain areas that are active in those tasks. So the particular area that the button area, the ethical button of the brain that is responsible, requires some strength or more strength to process that information. So that's why fresh blood rushes to that area, and that's how we know, all right, in this particular region moral reasoning is going on. Okay, so fMRI allows us to compare activities during the resting state and during the cognitive tasks. Resting state is, so first your fMRI is taken without like any task, like normal, like how does your brain look normal without any moral dilemma. Then second time you are taken to fMRI machine and you are given moral dilemmas, and the image, both the images are compared. So that's how we come to know that this is how it is happening. So it is the best method to know where something happens in the brain, but very poor to know when it happens. So after reading something, when it happens, like we are not so much of, we cannot do it accurately as we should be doing it. So then they discovered another mechanism. It is called event related potentials. So you might have seen people wearing helmet with electrodes. So there is a sentence, let's say there's a story of, let's say, Karan. Okay, so you are given this electrode helmet and you are reading this story. While you are reading this story, your data of the brain is recorded via an amplifier. Okay, so amplifier is constantly sending uh, different frequencies, and there are names of these frequencies. For example, N400 or P100 or P200, positive, negative, these are the names of the frequencies. So this data is recorded in a computer. We have a software that can single out exact impact of that particular story on your brain. So in this particular diagram, what you see, blue lines. So blue lines are brain activities for so many tasks. For example, when we blink our eyes, a line happens. When we, let's say, breathe in, breathe out, or when we sit in a particular posture, all these, and there are hundreds of such activities that require brain to send signals. So these are brain signals. So software will tell us which particular signal fluctuates during your reading of that story. So that is the clear and average data we can see. How does it work? An event related potential is the average pattern of electrical activity generated by neurons in response to a particular stimuli. An average, okay? So when scientists carry out these experiments, they carry out on hundreds of people. And then an average is decided. Okay, out of 100 people, 68 people decided that they will go for A, and they will go for or B, either way. So it is timing and pattern of action. So in our common terms, we call it brain computer interfaces, BCI. So with this, we know a lot of things, and we have now the particular area that is responsible for our moral reasoning or ethical decision. I call this ethical switch in the brain, but technically there are two names. It's called right temporal parietal junction or ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So based on where it is located, this is how these regions are named. So let's say there's a famous trolley example that the train is going and there are two tracks. The driver has to take one of the tracks, and on one track there's a deaf person who is doing some work, and on the other end there are five deaf people who are also working, and you can go either way. Okay, so you have to take a moral decision whether you will say one person or you will say five people. So when you are churning this out, this particular brain region will light up. It means this is the area. It also tells us that if something bad happens to this particular area, for example, something that happened to Charles Whitman or that person who had turned pedophile, then your sense of morality also fluctuates. So this parietal junction is the hub of neuromoral circuit, allowing for the processing of morally charged stimuli and subsequent generation of states such as empathy, charitableness, fairness, and or guilt. So when you so this area is the hub for these many processes and responses to this. So these images that you are seeing right now is from a research paper, and you can also find the same image on the Wikipedia also. Been carried out by number of cognitive scientists. So it is crime prevention by diagnosing lies in potential offenders shows involvement of the neuromoral circuit. So another name of this region is neuromoral circuit. So the yellow parts that you can see in all these seven areas, so these are the active areas during committing a crime or taking a moral decision. So this is how neurocriminology is also helping us in understanding how ethically we can be and how our brain helps us in understanding moral in a much accurate manner. Why are we getting so clinical about ethics? I mean, you must be wondering, oh my God, from 21st century, from communication, we have gone to ethics and neurology and evolutionary biology and mammals and what not. But why this person is going so clinical about ethics? There is a reason. The reason being, you can see on the screen, organizations and society suffer from the damages done or caused by unethical behavior. We are fed up. If you ask any Tom, Dick, and Harry walking in the Indian street, what is the biggest like problem in India? He would say or she would say corruption. Isn't corruption an ethical choice? And if it is harming us, if it is harming the society, shouldn't we do something? What are these unethical behavior? One is dishonesty, particularly with educated people. By educated, I mean degree holders. So many of them suffer from intellectual dishonesty, wherein they will use all the resources, but they will not work for that organization. So that is a problem. Lies, of course, to the organization, in families, in relationships, abusive behavior, yeah, between siblings, parents, families, of course, male, female working in the organization, abusive behavior, violating policies. Yeah, there are people who are excellent at bending the rules, if not breaking the rules. So when they bend the rules, it actually lowers or the standards of the organization. So then we have to think seriously about how can we use knowledge of neurology to guide or to address the issues of ethics. Can we do something like YouTube has done, something that Amazon has done, something that Game of Thrones has done? Can we do something about the ethical choice of the people? That is my humble proposition here. But the problem is when we know something, okay, so the idea of knowledge comes with the curse of manipulation. When we know something, when we tend to control or manipulate it sooner or later. So if you know how to guide people's moral choices, there are all chances that you will try to control and manipulate that group of people sooner or later by one or the other means. So it's always important to understand what we are knowing and what we should do about this knowing. Now, these are my questions to all of you. What if we know exact brain regions and chemicals responsible for guiding people's ethical judgments? What if? Today, whatever we know about the neuromoral circuit or parietal junction, it is very primitive understanding. We are still in infancy stage. But what if we get sure about the ethical button in the brain? What will we do? What if you know that certain employees of your organizations or members of your family have substantial impairment in elements of the neuromoral circuit? What will you do? Will you take a call? Will you address this issue? Because your knowledge of this will certainly take you to take a stand, take a decision, and you have to attend to that call. Think about these questions as the leader of the organization, as leader of the family. Will you not like to do something about it? If yes, now I'm going to show you is going to be difficult. What if in future you have pills that after taking these pills people will behave morally 100%? These are guaranteed pills. What if? These are my hypothetical, yeah, these are my products of my imagination. So two questions. One is, as an employee of an organization, will you take the pills? And second is, as an employer, will you ask your employees to take the pills? So these are the moral dilemmas I would like to leave you with, and my three submissions for all of us, and then we will conclude and we will go for the question and answer. My first submission is, we may use this knowledge to guide our students to behave ethically in the 21st century, because if they will not behave ethically, we are heading towards disaster. We are cooking recipe for disaster. Second is, we might use some cognitive tests and remedies to cure people who are morally diseased. I think if we can use such tests and remedies, it will be very useful, provided there is a consensus and there is a consent from everybody who is walking on the planet. Third is, this is again a very dangerous terrain, dangerous area that I am just shooting in dark. We might use pills or brain computer interfaces to enhance people's moral cognition. What will happen in such a situation? Imagine if there are peoples for good behavior, there can be people for pills for bad behavior. So, like again, we have to choose in the style of matrix. Well, these are some of the references that I have used, and I will use this presentation. I will share this presentation with all of you, and you may explore further reading materials, articles, videos, and books, and you will use this for the best of our students. With this, I really thank the organizers and all the participants for patiently listening and being part of this wonderful journey of communication and ethics in the 21st century. Thank you so much. Let's go to the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful session. We can take up the questions if there are any from the audience.
Yeah, you may use chat box or you can unmute and ask.
Ma'am, I would like to share my feedback.
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Thank you so much, sir, Vishal sir, for sharing your valuable information with all of us. Actually, we are facing many problems in 21st century, and I personally like the topics that highlighted the solution for the emerging threats in 21st century and the neuroscience of the ethics. And I'm sure that certain example that you have mentioned at the different levels would also be useful in our personal life and academics. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for the feedback, Sejal ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Uh,
Yes, anyone?
yeah. Good afternoon, sir. I must tell you, I must really give you credit. It was a fantastic session, probably the best in this STTP. I personally have a lot of inclination towards neurology and things, especially the EEG part and all that you're speaking about. It was eye opener to me, if you ask me. Uh, just a perspective which I would like to share. I mean, like you can even take this as a question. Uh, uh, Probably with the advancement of science and probably with like what you hypothesize or probably imagine that pills would be, say down the line we have those pills. Okay. Uh, I mean, like you might also be aware of certain entities like things happening in China where people are monitored and I believe you getting my point, what I'm
Yeah.
trying to tell. So my fundamental question is, aren't we taking away the essence of humanness in the human beings?
Mhm.
I mean, since we are talking about ethics here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I would like to respond to your perspective by sharing two things. First is, that human essence has always been hijacked by institutions like religion and ideology, even in the past. The fact is that we are becoming aware right now that, oh, our ancestors were hijacked by certain institutions. Now the institution, that agency has changed. We are moving more and more towards digital dictatorship. Let's say in Japan today, in so many factories, wearing a chip in your hand is compulsory, because when you work with your hands, and it scans so many things. For example, reading the barcodes. Okay, so it is a mandatory for, so it might happen in future that you'll be forced, like it will be like you'll be given choice, you have the employment if you do this. Secondly, recently I was reading this wonderful, and you might be aware of Yuval Noah Harari. So I was reading and translating a bit of his works, and he said something interesting about Corona. He said there's a fantastic solution for Corona. What is the solution? Everybody can be provided with a digital or smart belt that monitors temperature and so many heart reading or lungs reading, whether kidney is working very well. So entire our medical data can be recorded via this belt, and the data can be shared with our health centers. So let's say if there is first corona positive person in the city, immediately the notification will come on the central health station, and that person will be plucked out from the society and will be isolated. That's number one. So you can easily break the chain of infection. Okay, however, it is easier said than done. The problem will be, what if people like the great dictator of North Korea will have access to all the biomedical data? Then it is easy to sell any product to you. It is easy to look at your biomedical
Absolutely, sir.
data.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it is possible. So now whatever choices we will make during this corona are going to stay with us for very long period. So that's why global leadership is required for using whatever science and technology that we have. But the sad part is that today there is no global leadership.
Right, sir. Very true. Okay. Anyone else have any query?
I hope I bore you so much, because all the way from communication I had to take you the class of neurology, and being a new subject at times it bores.
Okay. Sir, thank you so much for sharing the knowledge with us. It was indeed a great learning experience for us. On behalf of GIT, I once again thank you, sir, for giving your time for this session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much.
We too, sir. Thank you. And now all the participants are requested to fill the feedback form that is in the chat box. Yes, sir. Now you can leave now, sir.
Thank you.
No
Thank you so
problem.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. And there is one change in tomorrow's schedule. As in the second session, Dr. Om Joshi will be the expert, but because of some emergency, he cannot join us. And on behalf of him, Deepak Mashru sir from Marwadi University will be our expert in the second session of tomorrow. Thank you.
We are open with the feedback link till 3:30. You can fill it now.